Good morning, everyone, or in the case of my second class, good afternoon. So, I want to talk to you guys about what we're going to be watching today. Now, we've been looking at these different indigenous cultures for a while now, and we're sort of coming to the end of this part of our class. And then I think after this, we're going to be returning more towards this types of writing exercises that we did at the beginning of the semester, plus some more work on skills for this research paper. So last week we looked at representation. So this week we're going to be looking at, I guess you could say, the limits of the idea of indigeneity. So we've been looking at all these indigenous cultures, and sometimes there is a very clear line between who is indigenous and who is not. There are other cases where the concept gets a little bit blurrier. So, for example, in the Caribbean islands here in North America, Cuba, Jamaica, places like this, there really is not an indigenous culture. There once was, but they were wiped out by European settlers and by disease. And there are almost none of them still left alive. On the other hand, these islands were slave colonies, and so you have people who are descended from slaves whose families have been living there for hundreds of years, who have developed their own very unique culture. So, we can ask the question, well, can we call them indigenous? And if they're not indigenous, then what are they? How do we define this? It gets a little bit tricky. So in today's class, we're going to be looking at another one of these areas where it gets a little bit trickier. So we're going to be looking at a place, very unusual place, maybe the most unusual place in the world, called Pitcairn Island. Now, Pitcairn Island is a tiny island, only 1 mile long, in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. It's one of the most isolated places in the world. It's so far away from anything else that if you take a globe and you look at Pitcairn Island, you can look at the entire side of the globe and there's almost no land to be seen. It's just ocean all around. It's a tiny island where about 50 people live. Only about 50 people. And they have lived for 200 years in isolation, basically. There is no airport there. There are no roads there. Well, now there finally is one road. There didn't used to be roads. And, the only way to get there is to fly to a nearby island, relatively nearby, and then take a boat. And even this way, it's so far away from where you can fly to that the boat journey will take about 3 days. So yeah, like I said, it's a very unusual place, to say the least. Also, it's unusual because of history. Now, like I said, it's in the South Pacific. And throughout the South Pacific, there are many small islands, very, very small islands for the most part. Places like Fiji, that's probably the most famous. These small islands, they many of them are inhabited. They have, as with any other place in the world, they have their own unique culture and so on. Now, Pitcairn, however, was not inhabited at all until about 200 years ago, when there was a famous incident known as the Mutiny on the Bounty. Okay, the Bounty, HMS Bounty, was a British ship in the South Pacific, and its captain was very cruel. And so the crew of the ship led a rebellion, a mutiny. They took over the ship, they executed their captain, and then they fled, because if they returned back to England, they would be hanged as traitors for executing their captain. So they, along with some men from one of the South Pacific islands, Tahiti, and men and women, they ended up taking the boat and hiding. They found Pitcairn, and they hid there because they knew the English didn't know about the island. It was in the middle of nowhere. They would never be found. Now, the people who live on the island, like I said, there are about 50 people still there. They're all descended from the British officers on the ship and from the men and women from Tahiti. So again, you can see this is an area where the whole question of, are they indigenous becomes complicated. Nobody is truly indigenous to the island, but the people who live there are partially descended from people who are indigenous to the South Pacific region, and their culture has many influences of Polynesian culture. Polynesian culture is one of the cultural groups of the South Pacific. There are three main groups: the Polynesian, Melanesian, and Micronesian. So there is this influence of Polynesian culture. So we have to ask the question: Can we call this indigenous? So Pitcairn became fairly famous around the world about 10 years ago for a very horrible reason, which the video we'll talk about extensively. It's a documentary, about an hour-long documentary that is called Trouble in Paradise, and it's about the revelations of horrible things that were happening, horrible abuse that was happening to children, young girls on Pitcairn. Now, I'll explain a little bit now. So basically, what was learned is that many of the adult men on Pitcairn were and had been for many, many years raping young girls, some of them very, very young, and that they were not being punished in any way for this, that the other people of the island were looking the other way, were ignoring what was happening. So I don't want to explain too much because you'll see the video and you'll learn about it. But I did want to, I guess, basically give you guys a warning. Now, this is about rape and sexual abuse of children. This is a very difficult issue. It's a very sensitive issue. It can be very, very traumatic. So I just do want to give you the opportunity. If anybody feels that they are simply not comfortable with this material, then if you feel like you need to leave, then do. Okay. I don't want to harm anybody. I don't want to traumatize anybody. And if you do stay and watch, if you feel like you need a minute to catch your breath, feel free to step out into the hallway and then come back in after you're okay. Okay, just please don't worry about doing this. Now, I should say, there's nothing explicit at all in it, but they do talk very frankly about what happened. So the reason why indigeneity comes into this is what the islanders who were accused basically said is that this is actually they said we do not consider this abuse. We consider it part of our indigenous Polynesian culture. Okay, and it is true that in many Polynesian cultures, it's considered acceptable for relatively young children, like maybe 12 years old, to engage in sexual activity. However, it's with other people their own same age. Whereas what happened on the island was quite different. It was, violence and rape and abuse by adult men of young children. So, I want us, we've looked before in the class at all these issues where indigenous cultures where members of indigenous cultures were asserting their rights to their beliefs, to their cultures, to their land. And in most cases, I think the people making these demands were quite sympathetic. They clearly had justice on their side. So now we're going to look at this place where, it's not so clear cut as that, where, we have to ask whether these people even have the right to make this claim that this is part of their indigenous culture. We also have to consider that there are clearly victims who are hurt very badly by this. We have a situation where, we cannot say that justice is clearly on the side of the people making these claims. So I wanted to look at this because I think it's a very interesting story, although also very upsetting, because it's so different from anything else we've looked at, and really, there's nowhere in the world that is like Pitcairn. So it's unique, and also I wanted us to watch this because it complicates everything, right? When we're looking at somebody at protesters fighting for clean water, or Rigoberto Menchú, fighting against the slaughter of villages, it's very easy for us to take our moral stand and say that we must support Indigenous people. I wanted to look at this case to make us stop and pause and consider what the limits of this are, if there are limits. I wanted to make things a bit more difficult, okay? A bit less morally clear. So that is about it for the video. So the video, it's a documentary. It's about 1 hour long. So after you watch this video, it'll take up the rest of the class. So discussion for this material will happen on Wednesday. I had wanted to assign you a reading for Wednesday about the Caribbean. I already talked about the Caribbean earlier. Unfortunately, I thought I had a PDF of the reading. It turns out I don't. And the book it's from, my copy of the book is in Dhaka. So I haven't been able to, it's far away from me. I can't get a copy made. I can't scan it in. I can't even read it myself, and I wasn't able to find an online version. So I'm going to have to reconsider what we're doing for Wednesday, and I'll figure it out. So I can't tell you what we're doing on Wednesday, except that for some of the class, we will discuss this material. Okay? So I will see you on Wednesday.